To see an otter in most parts of England today is a rare privilege. There are only one or two places where they survive in any numbers. Once they were everywhere. Although they were persecuted by gamekeepers and hunted by sportsmen, they remained a fairly common sight. They became more common when gamekeepers became scarce after the First World War, and they flourished into the mid-50s. Then their population suddenly crashed. Now, in some places, it's rising again, but not in others. For centuries, the otter's story has been one of ups and downs. The first full survey of otters in England was in 1977. Although Scotland, Ireland, and parts of Wales had strong populations, there were very few survivors in England, except for small areas in the West Country and East Anglia. The latest decline, which started in the mid-50s, coincided with an increase in the use of agricultural pesticides. Not just otters, but birds of prey, foxes and badgers died in large numbers from the use of DDT and cereal seed dressings called dieldrin and aldrin, which were introduced in 1955. By 1975, most farmers had stopped using them, but the damage was done. The poisons were in the waterways and in the food chain. Other human activities were given their share of the blame, including the growing practice of draining wetlands for farming, which robs the otter of food and shelter, and the increase in watery recreations such as boating and fishing. Later research showed that this disturbance had less effect than people had thought, and by the early 80s, the amount of dieldrin in freshwater fish had fallen well below danger level, although all otters, and presumably most human beings, still contain measurable amounts. Most of the other species have recovered, but the otter has been slow to benefit from the cleaner environment. Why this should be is a puzzle. Dieldrin is hardly used at all nowadays, but a new threat comes from PCBs, an enormous family of synthetic chemicals which are virtually indestructible and horribly poisonous. Like dieldrin, they collect in the food chain, accumulating in fish, particularly eels, near the top of the chain. Eels are the otter's favorite food. They're also rather dangerous to eat. They live a long time and they contain a high proportion of fat. Many toxic chemicals collect in an animal's fat without being passed out of its body, so that an old fat eel could contain a substantial dose. Although otters take a few game fish, such as trout, and some waterside birds, frogs, and even young rabbits, the main part of their diet is coarse fish, and especially eels. Although such freshwater food is getting cleaner, it still contains an element of danger for the otters. If the persecution of the otter has stopped, and most of its diet is no longer actually lethal, why has the population not bounded back to its earlier levels? Because otters are so elusive, information about them has been hard to come by. Until about 30 years ago, most information on the distribution of otters came from otter hunters. Their records showed the steady recovery of otter populations after the First World War, and it was they who first noticed the catastrophe of the mid-50s, which was almost certainly caused by dieldrin. Few otters were killed by the hunts after 1965, and hunting stopped altogether when otters were protected by law in the late 70s. The flow of information dried up, and someone else had to begin wading the waterways of England to monitor the otter population. The first otter survey of England, organized by the Nature Conservancy Council, started in 1977. One of the scientists involved was Dr. Paul Channin from the University of Exeter in Devon. He and his colleagues conducted a second survey 7 years later. Devon is a good place for otters. Small sheltered rivers wander among secluded fields. Agriculture is still run on a homely scale, in a patchwork of pastures and arable land, unlike the huge prairie-like fields of the agro-industry further east. Even during the lowest ebb of the otter's fortunes, Devon supported a good population. The little rivers may be wonderful for otters, but they're very hard for scientists to survey. The cover makes it difficult to search the rivers in detail, and in places they run deep and muddy. Dr. Channin and his colleagues were faced with an enormous task. In these rich and fertile rivers, this is the River Culm near Exeter, coarse fish are abundant and the eels are fat and healthy. One otter might be able to survive on as little as 10 miles of such a well-supplied river. As well as plentiful food, the River Culm offers miles of quiet backwaters with hidden grassy banks where the otter can bring their prey without any chance of being disturbed by humans or by their dogs. In fact, otters will often ignore humans or machinery working quite close by, but they're very wary of dogs. The humans offer little or no threat. Most often they don't even know the otter is there. But dogs have a good sense of smell, and the otter knows it. At the first sign of a dog, the otter will slip silently away. For a number of reasons, otters are very rarely seen by day. How on earth were Dr. Channin and his assistants to search the whole country, to count the otters?
We obviously couldn't search every part of every river in England, and we had to devise some system of sampling the whole country. The way we did this was to divide the country up into squares using the national grid, so that we eventually had a map which showed 50-kilometre squares, and we decided that we would search in alternate squares. This square shows the area just to the north of Dartmoor, which is quite close to where I live. Within each square, we then need to decide which parts of which rivers to search, and we had already decided that we needed to look at about 600 metres of riverbank. This gives you a good chance of finding signs of otters without giving you too much walking in areas where there are very few otters to be found. So we mapped out the rivers in each square and marked on them at approximately 5-kilometre intervals sites at which we were going to search. Each site that we searched, we recorded whether or not we found signs of otters.
One of the signs which the team looked for was footprints in the mud. It's easy to distinguish an otter's footprints from those of a dog. The otter has 5 toes and dogs have only 4. Sometimes a scattering of scales and fish bones shows where an otter has enjoyed a meal. The commonest sign is the otter's droppings, which still bear the old name used by hunters in Norman times, sprint. The River Teign, on the edge of Dartmoor, is quite different from the Culm. Its peaty waters flow swiftly down from the moor through a steep wooded valley. After a winter storm, it can be 8 feet deep, scouring the vegetation from its banks. There are very few coarse fish here, apart from eels. It's a trout stream, with occasional salmon and sea trout. The Teign's a beautiful river, and like many other Devon streams, it's popular with tourists. Hundreds of people come here to bathe or to walk the banks, enjoying themselves right in the middle of strong otter habitat. The fact that otters are able to withstand this sort of disturbance is very encouraging to the otter enthusiasts. It probably helps to explain why there was an increase in otter numbers between the 2 surveys. A particular attraction of the River Teign is a very popular pub beside Fingal Bridge. It attracts large numbers of people during the summer, but in spite of the crowds, the otters still use the river, mainly coming out at night when the people have gone. Scientists who attached radio transmitters to otters in Scotland were amazed to find that the otters could swim completely unnoticed between lines of anglers in broad daylight. Although they often move about by day, they are very rarely seen. Paul Channin and his team had to look for other clues.
We didn't expect to see any otters during the survey. Most often we found the otter spraints. Otters tend to leave their spraints in conspicuous places. So, for example, you need to search on large rocks, the bases of trees, or exposed roots at the riverside. Sometimes even on patches of sand, we find a single stone with an otter spraint upon it. Once you know what is conspicuous to an otter, it's not too difficult to find those places for yourself. Otters use their spraints in communication, and they do this by depositing a small amount of scent on each dropping as it passes out. Humans can actually detect this scent. It smells ottery, at least I think that's the best description of it. But to another otter, it means an awful lot more. So at the very least, they tell whether it's their droppings or somebody else's. And if they live in an area where there are a number of other otters resident, they can probably tell whether it's the scent of one of the local otters or somebody else who's just moved into the area. This spraint looks quite old. It's dry and crumbly, and there's not that much scent left on it. So it may have been deposited a few weeks ago and dried out in the sun. Not very far away, however, we found some more otter spraints, some of them even fresher. And yet, this is only 50 yards away from Fingal Bridge, a very popular tourist spot where large numbers of people will come practically every day during the summer to enjoy the Dartmoor scenery. The results of the first survey did show that we're very fortunate in the southwest because this is the area where otters seem to be doing best in England. When we compared our results for the second survey, carried out between 1984 and 1986, we were very pleased to discover that in this area the otter population had increased quite remarkably. And whereas during the first survey we found more signs of otters in the north and west of Devon, they now seem to be spreading across into the east, into the rivers which are actually more suitable, like the Colne, for example.
At the other side of England, in East Anglia, the otter has had more than its share of ups and downs. In 1979, East Anglia was regarded as one of the otter's strongholds. Its miles of waterways sheltered scattered groups of otters which might have been expected to survive and to multiply once the pressure was off them. But they suffered a serious decline. In the 1979 survey of Norfolk, signs of otters were found at 16% of sites. But by 1987, there was just one positive location out of 98 sites searched. Even though pesticides were no longer such a threat, the otter population continued to fall. One serious problem was death on the roads. Male otters wander overland from river to river. Consequently, they are more likely than females to be killed by cars. There was one otter underpass on the River Glaven, but the otters seemed to prefer to cross the road on the surface. If the male from a group is killed, the females are left to grow old and die with no chance of breeding. One by one, the territories became empty. Opinions differed on the condition of the water in East Anglia. When 3 aged, emaciated females were found dead on one river with high concentrations of toxic chemicals in what was left of their fat, some scientists said that this pointed to high levels of pollution in the environment. Others said the figures represented a lifetime's accumulation of chemicals, concentrated when the animals lost weight because they were getting old and in failing health. Whatever the cause, large tracts of Norfolk and Suffolk, where otters ought to live, were deserted in 1987. In an effort to re-establish the otters of East Anglia, the Otter Trust, based at Earsham in Norfolk, began releasing animals bred in captivity into suitable sites in the wild. The process starts early in the morning when the sleeping otter is shut up into its living quarters. Later, when it's had time to calm down, the otter is taken away from the trust to what will become its new territory. The release site has been selected not only for its suitability for otters, but also for its position among other groups which have been released. The aim is systematically to rebuild East Anglia's otter population. Between 1983 and 1993, the Otter Trust released 61 otters in 24 operations. At least 35 of the released groups have bred in the wild. It takes them a little time to settle in, but they usually breed about a year later. This pair is being released into an area of secluded woodland in North Norfolk. A large pen in which they are fed for 3 weeks gives them a sense of security. Then one night, the gate is left open. The otters seem reluctant to leave. They were brought up inside a wire enclosure, and the wider horizons beyond the fence may be a little unsettling at first. Eventually, though, the call of the river will become stronger than the whisper of home, and they'll go. The Otter Trust Release Program is being carried out in conjunction with the Nature Conservancy Council. The aim is to plant otters into each suitable river system in turn, until eventually the population reaches the level at which the animals resume their old custom of exploring overland and colonizing new systems. It has been a huge success. The released animals are supplied with food for the first couple of weeks after they have left the pen. Then the pen will be taken away, and 2 new wild otters will be back where they belong. At least 90% of the otters now living in East Anglia are Otter Trust releases, their children and their grandchildren. The usual quota for a new habitat is 1 male and 2 females, imitating what happens in nature, where a single male may have 2 or more females in his territory. The animals soon settle down into the playful and athletic courtship tussles of otters the world over. The females are very secretive and sensitive to disturbance when they're breeding. The holt is usually under the roots of a tree by the river, though some have been found hundreds of yards from water. This makes protecting the females more difficult. It's no good just keeping disturbance away from the river banks. Establishing a safe breeding place isn't the end of the matter. The tragic story of the first Minsmere release illustrates how quickly triumph can turn to defeat. A male and 2 females were released in 1985 inside the famous bird sanctuary on the East Coast. The following year, 1 female produced 2 cubs and the other 1. Everything looked rosy as the 3 cubs grew up in complete security. No one knows what sex they were, but suppose only 1 of the cubs were male. That would produce a group consisting of 2 males and 4 females, the recipe for expansion and the occupation of new territory. But in 1987, the adult male was killed by a car, and shortly afterwards a male cub from the litter of 2 also died on the road. There may have been another male cub, but there's no way of being sure. 4 females without a mate between them is the recipe for extinction. To make sure of a breeding group, a new male was later released to join the Minsmere otters. The results exceeded all expectations. By 1993, otters from the Minsmere group, together with those from other releases, had spread out to colonize East Anglia from the Essex borders to South Lincolnshire. A male otter can live at best for about 9 years. He can breed from the age of 18 months until senility overtakes him. His sister will breed first at about 2 years, and 1 captive female has bred successfully at the advanced age of 9.5. If they breed every year, otters soon fill up the available territory. Eventually, competition from his neighbors will drive the young male to explore the river further, almost always upstream, until finally he crosses the watershed into a new river system. The plan was simple, and it's working. The Otter Trust now breeds between 50 and 20 otters a year. A thriving wild population has now recovered to the level of the early 70s and is still growing by spreading into new river systems. One threat, which has proved less serious than people thought, is the challenge to the returning otter from the expanding mink population. Mink have been escaping from fur farms since the 30s, sometimes with the help of animal rights activists. They have become established as fierce and successful predators in the already crowded communities along southern English rivers. In some places, mink take the blame for wiping out birds which nest by water, such as moorhens and dabchicks. They're a particular threat to poultry farmers and wildfowl breeders who have to trap them regularly. People were worried that mink would compete with otters and slow down their recovery. However, it's now clear that the diets of the two animals scarcely overlap at all. Even if they did, the little mink, for all its ferocity, would not be able to stand up to an otter twice its size. Although mink have expanded and consolidated very successfully in the last 20 years, they too are susceptible to chemical pollution, especially PCBs, which may have put a brake on their progress. About the only possible danger from mink to the otter population is canine distemper, which can affect both species. The possibility, which worried people so much in the past, that mink might interfere with the otter population is put into perspective by the Russian attitude to the question. Over there, where wild mink are a valuable crop, the Russians are worried that they might be displaced by otters. The changes in the otter population of England since the first survey in 1977 have been mostly for the better, especially in the West. East Anglia suffered a setback in the 80s, but the Otter Trust's concentrated effort to redress the balance has been a success. After the ups and downs of the last 200 years, England's otters seem to be on the way up once again.